April sinned. It has been 4 days now, and it still hasn't moved away from in front of the door. I came across this journal earlier today while I was going through all of the supplies, trying to figure out what I have to work with and what I might have to ration. I thought that writing in it would be a good way to help pass the time until either help comes or I see a chance to run for it. After all, since there's no electricity up here, I don't have a television or a radio to keep myself occupied. And even if I did, I doubt that I could bring myself to turn them on. Even the idea of making more noise than I have to, of really making any noise at all, fills me with dread. It's mostly due to the fact that I don't want to attract its attention any more than I already have and give it further reason to continue sticking around and, admittedly, somewhat because I worry about being unable any possible changes outside. This constant paranoia makes it a challenge even to try reading some of the books and magazines that we brought up here with us. I can't really bring myself to concentrate on whatever it is that I'm trying to read. I'm too distracted, too busy jumping out of my skin over every creak of timber or gust of wind to really focus on any of it. I read the words, and then the door crowds them back out of my mind. The sounds that it makes during the night make it impossible to do anything other than cower up here in the loft, staring unblinkingly down at the door and praying to God to just make this thing go away already, for the sun to come up so that at least it will quiet back down for the day. Sometimes I honestly don't know which is worst, the tense silence during the days or listening to the door creak and moan as whatever the hell the thing is pushes on it all night long, while endlessly, wordlessly screaming at me. No? The nights are the worst, and I know it. And so I have decided to start writing in this journal so that I'll at least have something to do with my time other than just sitting here and staring at the door all day, just waiting for something to happen and praying that nothing will. The journal must be one of Katie's. She's always scribbling and writing in these things, especially when we come up here to the cabin. But I'm certain she won't mind my using it. Dear God, I hope she's all right. I hope that she's found help. April 3rd. Still no changes. Last night it started its screaming a few hours after sunset, pushing heavily on the door, seemingly trying to force its way inside. I honestly don't know which is worse first, the fact that the sound is so incredibly human in nature, or the fact that simultaneously makes it glaringly inhuman and unnatural. There is something about it, some quality that seems somehow familiar, and yet at the same time utterly alien to me. That vague feeling of familiarity frightens me more than anything else. Somehow it makes me think of an article I read once, years ago, about something called the Uncanny Valley. They said that it described feelings of revulsion towards something that closely imitated human life, but was still obviously something else. I can't think of a better term for the sounds this thing makes. Each morning, after the sun has come up and the thing has gone quiet for the day, I have removed my barricades and inspected the door, and so far, it still seems to be holding up fairly well. The hinges and locks remain firm and unbent, despite the creaking I have heard during the nighttime assaults. The wood doesn't seem to be cracking or warping anywhere. I braced it up as best I could with what I have, but I don't really have much to work with what furniture there is, a few assorted tools, a bit of rope. I don't know that wedging the couch up against the door is doing much good, but at least it's something. No, I think that it has everything to do with the quality of the door itself. My father really put his heart into it years ago when he built this place, and he built everything in here to last, from the roof to that door. All that had meant before was that Katie and I would have a nice place up in the mountains for years to come, where we could get away from the city for a while, a place where we could enjoy being in nature and the smell of fresh air and just being together with each other. Now his craftsmanship seems to be the only thing standing between me and I don't even want to know. Thank God that he decided against putting any windows in place when he built it. The fireplace still worries me, but I imagine that it must be too narrow for that thing to fit down. At least I hope that it is. I spent this morning gathering up all of the empty buckets, jars, and tubs that I could find and filling them with water from the hand pump he built in the kitchen area. I don't honestly even know why I did it. I really can't see how it would reasonably be able to tamper with the well or affect the water supply, and yet, all the same, it felt like the right thing to do. Besides, the last thing I need is to run out of water somehow, and a bit of precaution isn't going to hurt anything. If nothing else, it gave me something to occupy my time with. There's enough canned food stored up here to last me for quite some time, especially if I rationed it a bit. But I hope there won't be too much of a need to worry about that. I have to imagine that whatever it is out there is either going to get tired of trying to get at me or waiting on me to come out, or that help comes. But it's always better to be safe than sorry. It's hard to believe that just 5 days ago, Katie and I were driving up here, laughing like we were teenagers again, talking about when we wanted to go for a hike and when we wanted to do some fishing, and how nice it was going to be to get out of the city for an entire month and just how much we needed it. To think that was less than a week ago, and now it somehow seems like a memory from another time, like seeing something from someone else's life. Despite how much we had enjoyed the drive up here, I had known that something was wrong almost as soon as we got out of the car. At first, I could not figure out what seemed to be bothering me, but as we were carrying things in from the car and unpacking, the wind had changed. A strange odor, almost a sort of musk, had drifted in out of the forest on the breeze, and when I smelled it, I had nearly dropped the box I was carrying. I saw the color drain from Katie's face when she came back outside and smelled it as well. She asked me what it could be while covering her nose with her shirt, but I told her that I didn't know. I had no answer for her, as it was nothing quite like I had ever smelled before. It wasn't a particularly strong smell, or even all that putrid. But there had been something wrong about it, something invasive and unclean. You see, my father had been bringing me up here and on camping trips for as long as I could remember, and so I was no stranger to the smells of death and decay. I could still remember that once, when I was young, we had been hiking and had found a dead deer in the water, and that we hadn't been able to get the smell entirely out of our clothes for days. But this was something entirely different. The instant I had smelled it, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and my stomach had tightened into a knot. I had felt the overpowering urge to climb back into the car, start driving, and never, ever look back. The need to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was causing that smell. I had told Katie as much, and though it obviously bothered her as well, she had laughed and told me that it was only some dead thing out in the woods, that I was being silly and getting upset over nothing. Now, looking back at how pale her face had been, and how nervous that laugh had sounded, I know that she hadn't really believed that. God, why couldn't she have just trusted me? Were you just too proud to admit that you felt the same feelings of terror that I had? Or maybe it had simply been because it had taken us so long to manage to finally set up an entire month off from work together. It had taken more than a couple of sacrifices on both our parts, but we had known that it was really going to be worth it. Maybe that's why she refused to go, and maybe it's how she finally convinced me to stay. And so, instead, we had continued unloading the car, unpacking everything we would need, getting ready to settle in for the next month together. I had been unable to keep myself from glancing at the forest anytime we were outside, half expecting to see something, though I could not say what, out there in the shadows. I had known that Katie was right, that something had simply died nearby. And yet, no matter how many times I told myself that, I still could not quite make myself believe it. I don't think Katie did either, though she hid it better than I could. It seemed as though the longer we were around the smell, the more intense my discomfort became, and I felt the beginnings of a tension headache begin to steadily spread from the back of my head. By the end, I think that the only thing that had really kept me here was the fact that I was going to propose to her while we were up here. I can't even stand to look at the ring right now, and I know that I won't be able to until I know that she's safe, that she's all right. Until I can know that, until I can hold her in my arms again, it has become nothing more than a symbol of how much I might have lost and what a fool I was for letting us stay. Katie, wherever you are, know that I love you. April 4th. Still no changes to report, just another night of that thing trying to force in the door, screaming at me hour after hour, all through the night. Why does it scream like that? Is it hoping that it can scare me out of my little hole here, thinking that it can frighten me into making some sort of a run for it? Could it serve sort of purpose beyond my understanding? Perhaps it's intelligent and just derives some sort of sick pleasure from knowing that it's tormenting me in here. I'm not about to try asking it. I have enough difficulty just bringing myself to get close enough to the door in order to check it for damage anymore. Just knowing that it's sitting there on the other side, waiting, it's just too much for me to handle at this point. I know that I should man up and move the rubber stopper away from the bottom of the door, that I should be trying to watch it and see if it either comes and goes or just incessantly sits there waiting day in and day out. I know that I should, but I can't bring myself to do it. I just can't handle the idea of those eyes staring in here under the door. That would be even worse than the screaming, and that's already almost more than I can bear. I saw them once, and that was more than enough. My headache had grown steadily worse as the day had gone until it had become almost unbearable, and I knew that I would have to lie down for a while. Katie had suggested that it was most likely due to the change in altitude during the drive up here, that she knew it could sometimes cause headaches like this. Of course, I reminded her that this had never happened to me before, and that I had been coming up here for years now. She simply reminded me that I was getting old, and that these things happen eventually. I settled for taking some aspirin to help ease the pain in my head, climbing up into the loft, and lying down in bed while she finished unpacking things and setting up around the cabin. I had made her promise to wake me up if she needed anything and to not go too far from the cabin until after I had woken up. I didn't even want her to go outside without me, but I knew that she would have been upset by that. In the end, she told me that I was being silly, but promised nonetheless, and I fell asleep almost immediately after lying down. When I awoke, the smell had become a stench, overpowering enough to leave me gagging. I cannot properly describe it even now, after having spent all these days with it. Have you ever been down into an old root cellar, or some damp, dark place in the earth? Perhaps a house that has recently flooded or suffered from a long leaking roof. That damp, musty, clinging smell of mildew and mold. There was something of both of those to it. Added to that were traces of rot and putrefaction. There was also a cloying, almost sickly sweet quality to it that was somehow even worse than the stink of decay. Something acidic, almost chemical as well. It was a dozen terrible smells all wrapped up into one repugnant, awful stench. Finally, I could hold it back no longer, and I leaned over the side of the bed and heaved onto the floor. Once I had finished, I called out to Katie, but received no response. I felt weak and bewildered as I tried to climb out of the bed, and I practically fell into my own vomit more than once. I called out to her again, more urgently now. Still nothing. I began to cry out for her frantically. Nothing. I made my way down the ladder to the floor of the cabin, and in my haste and in my current state, I nearly fell at one point. I might have broken my neck if I had fallen from that high, and part of me wishes that I had. I wandered the cabin, coughing and choking from the smell, occasionally stopping to retch and heave, until I realized that she was not in here with me. I turned towards the door, stumbling towards it, feeling my panic grow with every passing second. I knew that I had to find her, and get her in the car, and get us as far away from this place as possible, no matter how silly it might have sounded to her. As I drew closer to the door, the smell became steadily stronger, and I realized that whatever it was coming from must have moved closer somehow. As I reached out for the door, I was overcome by a sense of dread. I suddenly knew that I could no more bring myself to reach out and to twist that knob than I could pluck the moon from the sky or sprout wings and fly away from this place. No, some part of me, some animal instinct residing quietly until now in the back of my brain, knew that I must not open that door and held me back from doing so. For reasons equally beyond my understanding, I instead dropped down and pulled away at the rubber stopper that we had installed upon the bottom of the door. You see, as the cabin had settled and subtly shifted over the years, a small gap had formed beneath the bottom of the door. It was no more than a couple of inches, but still enough to let in a draft or a bit of rain if the wind blew the right way. And so we had installed a bit of rubber along its bottom to properly seal it up. I pulled that away now, and despite how strong the smell was as it poured in through the new gap, I leaned down and looked outside. Darkness. Or at least what I at first took to be darkness. All across the bottom of the door, all that I could see was pure, unbroken black. I was momentarily confused. It had still been fairly early in the morning when we had arrived and I had laid down. Surely I hadn't slept that long. I looked at my watch, only to discover that it was barely past 3 p.m. in the afternoon, meaning that I had only slept for a couple of hours. I sat there in confusion for a moment, trying to piece it all together, and looked beneath the door once again. The longer I looked out, the more and more I came to realize that I was not looking into some lightless distance, but rather at an object lying before the door. From what I could tell, it seemed to be incredibly smooth, and though I could not be certain, the way that it caught the light from inside made it seem as though its surface might be of either a damp or slimy texture. The first thing to spring to mind was of some colossal black slug laid out before the doorway, and I nearly vomited once again. As I lay there staring at it, I noticed that a spot on its surface was becoming gradually lighter than the rest. I fixed my eye upon it and watched with mixed horror and curiosity as a white object, about the size of a quarter, seemed to arise from within the substance to sit upon the surface. The only way in which I can describe it is to say that it looked somewhat like a peeled grape, except that it was entirely white. As I watched, more began to steadily surface, ranging in size from a dime to what I would estimate was likely closer to my fist, all of them looking like peeled albino grapes. I lay for some time watching these things, trying to figure out just what I was seeing, when it began to dawn upon me. I slowly slid myself across the floor to the other side of the doorway, and they twitched, following me in my movement. They were eyes. I screamed then and launched myself back away from the door, moving as far away as possible. Eventually,